Hello, everyone, and welcome to Raw Men, episode, I think, number 55 now. And we're going to be talking to Dr. Wynne LeGrow. And the interesting aspect of his story was running for the U.S. House of Representatives as an open atheist. Dr. LeGrow, welcome to the Raw Men. Why don't you tell us all about running for U.S. House of Representatives as an open atheist?
Well, thank you for having me on. I ran initially in 2008 and I didn't get the nomination for the House of Representatives. So I retired in about 2009 from my medical practice and ran again in 2010. And there was really one issue and two individuals that motivated me to run. The issue was global climate change. I am absolutely convinced that global climate change is real, caused by human beings burning fossil fuels. And we have one entire political party who refuses to accept that.
Yeah, I was amazed in 1988 when George Bush Sr. was running, and I couldn't understand why climate change, why the environment, I think we called it environmentalism at that point, why that wasn't an issue. Why is nobody acknowledging this? And I was naively unaware that people with their financial concerns and looking to the next quarter and how much more money they're going to make off the oil industry is more important than anything that they do to the environment. I don't think that there's actually a sincere disbelief in the impact that they're having. There's just no consideration of it. They flat don't care.
Well, there was the Sinclair Lewis line. He said, "It is difficult for a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it."
Exactly, yes.
And that's the situation with the oil companies. I mean, they are going to pay for whatever members of the House and Senate that they need to advance their cause. And so I have kept up on that over the years. In my medical practice, I was not active politically, but I tried to keep up. And I was more and more alarmed by the fact that global climate change was not being addressed in a serious fashion, or certainly Al Gore was addressing it in a serious fashion, and it's too bad he didn't get elected. But
kind of technically did. I mean,
he got
George
the majority.
W. Bush.
Yeah, that didn't help us. When the guy's brother was the governor of Florida, he took care of things there.
Yeah.
So that was the one issue that motivated me to run. And then there were two individuals that motivated me to run. Now, a lot of people my age, and I'm 71. John F. Kennedy was elected when I was 15. And so a lot of people my age say they were motivated by Kennedy to get into politics. Well, I was motivated by George W. Bush. He's a year younger than I am. He was a failure at just about everything he did throughout his life. He got into Yale because who his father was, and then he didn't do well at Yale, and he got into Harvard Business School again because of his father. And he was a failure in Texas as an oil man, and he ran for Congress and lost. And then with some help, he became governor of Texas. But I thought, if George W. Bush can be president, I can certainly be a congressman. Motivated me to run. And the other motivating individual was Republican Congressman Randy Forbes.
And this was your opponent at that time?
Yes, he was first elected in 2001 when there was a special election when the previous congressman died. So he had been in office since 2001. And he usually won by just showing up. And mainly what he stressed was that he was a Christian. And he tried to introduce religion into government whenever possible. He would hold bills up. There was some bill that about the visitor center in Congress, and he held it up until he was assured that they put "In God We Trust" in large letters up there. He was going to block it until they agreed to that. And he introduced a bill that said, and this is in quote, "Whereas the Holy Bible is God's word." That was in a bill that he introduced. And fortunately, it didn't go anywhere, but if it had gone through, he would have sort of insinuated the Bible into the law of the land. And he, at times, ran unopposed. And when he did have opposition, he mainly had to show up. Now, Obama won this district when he first ran in 2008 by a very narrow margin. And then they took some of the African-American voters out of the district. Bobby Scott, who's African-American and already won easily. So they took those out, and then in 2012, Romney won by a slight margin in this district. But Randy Forbes was ensconced well enough that nobody really came close to getting him out of office. So that's how I got to where I was.
The way that they took the black voters out, you mean gerrymandering?
Yes.
It's amazing to me. It's amazing to me that this is not viewed by everyone who does this as a form of corruption. I mean, you know, my introduction to poli sci, I remember included a lesson where they talked about, you know, filibustering, and I couldn't say that's a thing. That's a way that adults, you know, actually conduct government. You know, is like by reading the phone book to deliberately waste everybody's time. How is this?
Why do they allow that?
Yeah, who conceived this? Who thought this would be? Hey, I'll tell you what. Let's do this. Let's have this thing where somebody can waste everybody's time until no work gets done. That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah,
you know, and let's divide up the districts as a deliberately corrupt means of screwing over the opponent without any kind of ethics. That sounds like a good idea, and people voted for that.
Well, both parties have done it, and so it always sounds like a good idea to the party in power. And when they are out of power, it's not a good idea, but then they don't have the authority to do anything about it. So that's how it's perpetuated, because, you know, Democrats do it too. And of course, that's what finally got Randy Forbes. He is still the congressman, but come January, he won't be.
Now, I want to throw in there is the same thing that motivated you, more or less, motivated me. I mean, if I were to put a single name on it, it was Rick Santorum. The crap that he was, yeah, seriously. I mean, it was the things that he was publishing and doing around Y2K was really what kind of activated me, so to speak. Because I mean, he was very overt.
Right.
At that time they were bragging about their ultimate agenda, what they'd intended to do in their end game. Maybe they were open about it because they didn't think that there would be a problem admitting this, or this was just a brag to get more support. But he and several others from like the Chalcedon Institute and such said that they were bragging. Some of these people were bragging directly to me that they had specifically elected and positioned judges and senators and other such people so that they could bring about this what they called a culture war, that they're going to they're going to recapture American culture, was the way a lot of these people put it, so that they could create a theocracy. Well, they didn't often use the word theocracy, but they did say they wanted to set up a government where they would enforce God's law. And in some cases, these people were so extreme about it. They weren't just wanting to put "in God we trust" on things. They said they actually wanted the U.S. government to enforce Levitical law. As in, it suddenly is a death sentence to work on weekends.
Yes,
and I don't know how your hospital emergency rooms are supposed to operate if you're going to have a death sentence for working on weekends. But, there's no kind of forethought to these people. There's no kind of reasoning with that thought.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the reason they were so open about it was it seemed at that time like a winning strategy. I mean, they tried to restrict gay rights up until the last year or two when the whole tide started to shift. But they pushed to get that on state elections so that it would get motivated people out to vote. And I don't know if you know, but who's the guy that was Bush's brain? Karl Rove, pushing religion into everything. And it was so cynical because Karl Rove is an atheist. And that was not well known, but it was totally cynical. He was pushing all this religious stuff, and Bush, of course, went along with it because they thought that was a winning strategy.
Well,
Not because they...
You remember the last interview that George W. Bush gave as president? In that last interview, I don't remember who the interviewer was, but they asked, he said something about the truth of evolution. And it was a surprising thing that he would say this sentence that included the words, the truth of evolution. And the interviewer, knowing how he had promoted intelligent design with that slogan, you know, we think the jury is still out on that, all that nonsense. The interviewer says, so you don't think that the Bible is literally true? And George W. Bush, his response was that he laughed and said, probably not. So here's a man who knew, who's now admitting that he knew all this time that he was full of bullshit.
Yeah, I didn't see that interview. I did see when it came up once, they were talking about whether evolution and creationism should both be taught, and playing the politician, he said, well, yeah, I think they should both be taught so everyone can be exposed to both sides of the argument, as if there really is an argument, which of course there isn't. Yes. So to expand a little on one of the other things, now the fourth congressional district at that time was more than 30% African American. So I would go around and talk to the different Democratic groups in the counties. And most of them were predominantly African American. My patients, I was a nephrologist, so I had a dialysis unit, and 90% of my patients were African American. So when I would go around to these meetings, then I had to deal with the question of, okay, I know I'm going to come out as an atheist, but the African American community is very religious. How are they going to handle that? And I had a number of people advising me. The first time I tried to run, I didn't have anybody, and I sort of crashed and burned. The second time I realized I needed to have advisors, people who had been down this road before and knew where the potholes were. Mm-hmm. So I hired people to help me. And we had one meeting where a young African-American fellow was there, and I thought, well, I'll run this by him and see how he reacts. And so I said, well, you know, I plan to run openly as an atheist. And he said, you can't do that. You can't talk to the African-American community and be open about being an atheist. You can't do it. It was, you know, it was a visceral reaction from him. You just can't do that. And I thought, well, I'm going to, but I guess you're telling me what I'm up against here. And when I first came to town, a young lawyer came to town and ran for Commonwealth's attorney, and I didn't figure he had much a chance being new in town. And the election came up, and he was running against a guy who'd been there for years, and both of these guys were white. And the young fellow won rather easily. And I wondered how that happened. And I found out that he had gone around to all the black churches and presented his case to them, you know, showed them the respect of talking to them personally, presented his case, asked for their votes, and that's why he won. So I had never heard of that, but by the time I ran, it was accepted. If you're a Democrat, you have to go to the black churches. And so before I had publicly outed myself, I did a few times. And when, I don't know if you've ever gone to a black church, but when a white person goes to a black church, they are treated wonderfully. I mean, everybody there is friendly. They escort you up and sit you near the front. And somebody said, "Are you sure that always happens?" And people had told me it happened. It certainly happened every time I went there. The music in the black churches is much better. My father was a Protestant minister. I grew up in the Congregational church. My mother was a school teacher. So the first 18 years of my life, I went to church every Sunday. And let me tell you pardon me?
Oh, I just wanted to throw in that, here recently, I did an interview with Sean Brady, who is black, running for U.S. Senate, and he's running also as an open atheist. And what's interesting about that was that just prior to him, I had interviewed a pastor who was part of a documentary talking about the exodus away from the black church. That there's quite a lot of people that are losing their religion and that are walking away from the black churches, and many of them say that that there's you were talking about the cold reaction, the you can't do that reaction. Well, this is what they're getting from within their own community. That the black religious bloc is, of course, is reacting much more so than the white constituency, or whatever is the appropriate word there. And adding to that, I have a friend in Los Angeles who's running for state senate right now, and he's not only black, but he is open atheist as well. And he didn't figure that made that was good enough against his chances, so he's actually running as an open Satanist.
Okay, all right. Well, good luck with that. Well, that's California, right? So I'm in the Bible Belt. I'm about halfway between Jerry Falwell's Liberty University and Pat Robertson's Regent University.
Oh my word!
So to me, that's the Bible Belt.
Don't they still burn people like you there?
Well, they don't look upon me fondly. So at any rate, I went to a few black churches, and the best experience was when the preacher would introduce me, and I would stand up and say hello and sit down, and he'd say I was the Democrat running for Congress, and that worked out all right. But what sort of pushed me over the brink was I went to this big Petersburg, and it was Women's Sunday. So for the most part, women ran the service. And at the end, the one man that was involved, he got up and introduced the dignitaries, which I guess was me. But there was one lady who was the Virginia House of Delegates member, and she stood up and said a few words. And then there was, I don't know if you remember, Venus Flytrap, WKRP in Cincinnati.
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay, well his name is Tim Reed, and he lives in Petersburg, and his wife was sitting next to me, and she was an actress also. So they introduced her, but she didn't speak. And then he introduced me, and they said, "Well, why don't you come on up to the pulpit?" And I thought, oh my gosh. So my heart is pounding, and I'm going up there thinking what I'm going to say. And I get up there, and I thanked them for having me there. I said it was a lovely sermon. The music was great, and the music in the black churches is much better than music in white churches. And I mentioned everyone whose name I could think of and thanked them, and turned around and went back to the pew and sat down. And the guy looked at me and he says, "That's it?" I said, "Yeah, that's it." He said, "Well, do you have anyone else with?" I said, "Well, my campaign manager is over here. My wife and campaign manager came with me." So they called him up. Now, he was one of many I had, and he was 18 years old and probably looked younger. And so he went, and his father was a minister, and he got up and somehow started quoting scripture, Isaiah 6:8, I think it was. And I heard the word of the Lord saying, "Who will go, and who shall I send, and who will go for me?" And I said, "Here am I, send me." And then he would bring up a particular topic like religion or no, like education or healthcare or something. And he would say, "We need this problem to be taken care of." And Dr. LeGrow said, "Here am I, send me." And the congregation loved it. I mean, amen, hallelujah. And so he had them in revival mode by the time he finished. And so it ended shortly after that. And as I went out, I thought, this has got to end. I can't do this anymore. So that was the last black church I went to. And sometime after that, what I did was, well, I had some campaign managers who didn't want me to put the word out that I was an atheist. They said, that'll hurt you. And I thought, look, I'm going to lose unless I distinguish myself from all the other Democrats who are likely to lose. And if you remember, 2010 was a bloodbath for Democrats. That was 2 years into the Obama administration. And there was only one Republican or one Democrat challenging an incumbent Republican to win in the entire country. And that was a very weird situation in Louisiana. So finally, I got a campaign manager who was Catholic, but he was very much a Democrat, and he thought it was a good idea for me to get the word out. So he put in, I composed an essay about why I was running and the fact that the political reasons I was running, and also that I was an atheist and open about it. And that was that came out on one of the websites I'm blocking on. But at any rate, it was picked up nationally. Daily Cause. And so that was seen by many people. And what we were hoping, of course, was for something on national television where many people would get to know that I was running and contribute some money. I needed some money, and one of the worst parts of running is having to spend hours on the phone calling people asking for money. So I was hoping to get some national attention. And we did get a rather big article in the Virginian Pilot. It was a front page article. And if you've seen my book, it's a picture of me holding up the front page of the Virginian Pilot. And I'm holding up a newspaper, and the newspaper said, "In God only one trusts." And it's talking about the election between me and Forbes. And so in the article in the Virginian Pilot, he talked about my being an atheist. And he mentioned that I had gone to visit an African-American preacher after I had come out of it as an atheist. This was a preacher over in Chesapeake, and he was about 87 years old, and he'd been there for years, and he was well known and well respected. But he was quoted in the paper as saying, "I couldn't vote for someone who doesn't believe in a higher being." And well, this newspaper article came out before, and I saw that, and I thought, how am I going to deal with this? So I called him. Jake Manley was his name. So I called Reverend Manley, and I said, I think you're judging me without even knowing me. I could go over and speak with him in person. So he agreed to it, and I went over there, took my wife, who is a lifelong Lutheran, and my finance manager, who was African-American. And so we went over there and talked with him and his assistant pastor. And it was a very interesting discussion. We ended up talking for about an hour and a half. And what he said was the way they look at it is all good comes from God. And I told him I was a nephrologist, and most of my patients were African-American who were on dialysis for kidney failure. And he couldn't quite figure it out. It didn't fit into his idea of what an atheist was. And he said, and he knew my father was a minister because I'd been public about that. And he said, well, I think your father, who had died by then, is working through you, putting God's grace in you. He couldn't accept that an atheist would do something because it's the thing to do. And then he tried to bring my wife into it. Well, she's bringing God's influence on you. And so that appeared in another article appeared, and that was mentioned. And then we got a call from Countdown. Keith Olbermann show, and they had read about the two of us talking, and they wanted to get us both on Countdown. And I thought, well, good, this will be our breakthrough. This will get us some national attention, and it'll take off from there. But they wanted me to talk to Reverend Manley, and so I called him, and he agreed to it. And then the more he talked, the more anxious he got. I'll go on, but I'm not going to say that I'll vote for you. That vote is private. I won't say I'll vote for you, but I'll go on the show. Because when I had talked to him, he had gotten rather enthusiastic and said to his assistant pastor, "We need to get this man elected." And then we called back to Obermann's show, and we gave him a bunch of numbers to call, and they never could get through to him. And so we finally called him back, and he said, "Well, I didn't get any calls." So it was clear that wasn't going to happen. And then they said, "Well, maybe we'll just talk to you and not him." And that didn't happen. Apparently they wanted some balance, or they talked to somebody else about having an atheist on. And what I learned was nobody wanted to touch an atheist running for office. Liberals didn't, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans. There was Lionel Spruill is an African-American House of Delegates member in Chesapeake, and Chesapeake is part of the 4th District. He's a state House of Delegates member. And I had talked to him about being an atheist, and he said, "Well, I can't take you to any black churches knowing you're an atheist." He said, that would hurt me. That would hurt him. So he couldn't do that. And I said, "Okay, that's fine." But he didn't seem to have any other problem with it. Well, he went on a radio show, which I managed to get a recording of. And at one point he says, "I'm not going to hell behind no Democrat." So that was a Democrat, a state delegate, Democratic state delegate in Virginia, saying he wasn't going to support me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I did have one state senator.
I got to jump in, and I'm so bewildered. I do not know what the appeal of religion can be. I mean, the only value information has is how true you can show it to be, and otherwise, if you can't show that it's true at all, that it has no value at all. So, the value of faith, there isn't any. To me, in my philosophy, there can't be. So I don't understand how people cannot understand that that good comes from your humanity, that they have to make up these excuses that good has to come from somewhere else. And I've had people tell me that if I make sense, it is only because the devil is speaking through me. And you're saying that if you do something good, they make a similar excuse that it's the influence of your wife or your dead father working through you or something like that. I don't understand why all the rationalization and how is it that believing impossible nonsense for no good reason makes you a good person? That, especially when we have all the evidence showing the exact contrary statistically.
Well, it's all in how you look at it. And when something bad happens, God works in mysterious ways. I mean, and when the tornado comes through and tears down your house and your church, I'm so grateful to God that I survived. You cannot argue with it. It is a given. I mean, I grew up in the church. I'm living in the Bible Belt. It is not questioned. You don't question it.
Well, one of the things I'm looking toward is, I know that the people that I just told you about that I know they're running for state senate, that are running for U.S. Senate and so forth. I mean, there's quite a lot of people at the grassroots who have just suddenly started running for public office, and these are the Bernie-crats. These are the people that were inspired by Bernie Sanders to get. If you can't vote in change from the top down, then you start from the bottom up, and so new people. A whole new generation are getting into this. And this is concordant with the rise of the atheism movement. This is concordant with the exodus from the black church. So we're hoping that in a year or two that the environment will be better improved. So that by the time we get to the 2018 elections, that there will be a lot more if not Democrats, Green or whatever, that there will be a lot more, atheist, secular people, humanist concerns will begin to fight back that ridiculous stereotype or that requirement, it seems, that you have to pretend to believe as if that means anything. I mean, like when what the hell was his name now? The guy that said it was a presidential candidate. I can't believe I can't think of his name. Newt Gingrich, who said that that he can't. How could he trust you with power if you don't pray? I have exactly the opposite problem. How can I trust you with the nuclear codes if you think that if you're a dominionist and you're trying to bring about the end times? It's like that comedian said, let me be your servant, O Lord. I'm ready to push the button. You just tell me when.
Right. Yeah. And
how can these people have an environmental concern? How can they look to the future if they don't think that you have one? If they think that, any minute now, Jesus is going to come back and save us from ourselves, and that the requirement that we do beforehand is like what Ann Coulter said, that she said that sweaters are not the biblical way, that big gas guzzling SUVs with the wet bar is the biblical way, and that we are supposed to dominate and subdue and be fruitful and multiply and bring more souls into the Lord. So we're supposed to have as many babies as we possibly can, and we're supposed to burn up all the resources we possibly can, because we have to commit to this idea that there's going to be a Jesus coming back, and that maybe if we all believe hard enough, maybe we could make it happen.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I mean, I'm This is Trump territory down here. We're not talking about rational thought.
Thank you for making that association.
So, there was somebody, one of the women's suffragettes, who she said, anybody who says they are going to do God's will, because I find they want to do.
Yeah. And
I talked to God and God told me, well, it's what you want to do.
Yeah, everybody's God hates exactly what you hate for the same reasons that you hate it.
Right.
And that's why your God will always forgive you. And that's what's so great about God. You don't actually have to do anything to help anybody. You can just wish upon a star that they get the help that they need, and then pretend that you did something.
Well, that's the way some of them look at it. It's not the way all of them look at it. I mean, I got a lot of guidance from my mother. That certainly wasn't the way she looked at it. And some would say she wasn't Christian, because I remember when I was young, this story about Jesus miraculously rising from the dead after 3 years. I had no plans of being a doctor then, but that didn't make any sense to me. And so I asked.
After 3 years would have been a much better miracle, but it was actually 3 days.
Did I say years?
Yeah.
3 days. 3 days. So I asked her about that, and she said, well, when somebody dies and they all get together afterward and tell stories about it, that person's presence when you tell stories about them. I said, oh, okay. So she was interpreting it in a way that made sense, not that he miraculously came back to life. And so I'm sure that explanation would make her not a Christian by many people who live in this area. But she was much more concerned about how humans treat one another than what their specific belief system was.
I see that's the other problem I have. Is why are people being judged by whether they believe? Because that's the least important criteria. It's what your actions are. That should matter. But according to the theology, there is no condition under which a good, saintly, and charitable, kind atheist, non-believer could ever get into heaven in the theology. Not that I even care to, if there was such a place, I wouldn't want to go. But any sin can be forgiven, except the sin of disbelief. So it
But
doesn't
you
matter
have
how
heard,
good you are, you can still get into heaven. All you got to say is, please forgive me, and Jesus will forgive you. Just as, the story, the fable is, you can get anything you want, just as long as you don't ask for anything that actually requires a miracle.
but you have heard what the Pope said about that.
Yeah,
The
I know.
Pope,
The Pope twice said that atheists, the current Pope, Francis, said twice that atheists can get into heaven. And at least the first time that he did that, some of the other bishops and everything made a follow-up statement yesterday or the day after, saying that His Eminence misspoke.
okay. But I mean, that, what that tells me, it's on two levels. One, what do I care what he thinks about going to heaven, because there is no heaven. But on the other side, he is very much being non-judgmental. Who am I to judge, he has said, concerning gays. And it would tell me that he would, if I were to meet him, which isn't going to happen, but if I were, he would relate to me on a one-to-one basis, not a judgmental basis, whereas most of the Southern Baptists that surround me think they're going to heaven and I'm not. So that puts them on a much higher moral plane in their view. And so it's very difficult to have a one-on-one relationship with somebody who is judging you right off the bat.
Yeah.
So I didn't discuss religion with my patients.
Wisely, yeah. All right. So about the environment, I want to touch a little bit on that because this is a concern of mine too. I live in Texas, where it's a funny thing that they won't admit climate change, and even when they do kind of admit that it happens, they refuse to admit that that humans have anything to do with it. When the polar ice caps began melting, there were people there who actually published a statement that it wasn't human or anthropogenic climate change. It was God opening up new places to drill for oil.
Oh, good. So we can accelerate the climate change.
Yes, because again, there seems to be, and I've noticed this, people want to believe in God so badly that they will create situations where they create a desperation to help their belief, so that they become more committed to their belief. They'll actually create situations where if it turns out that it's not true, then they'll be absolutely screwed. So they have to believe, or else.
Yeah.
And I've seen people make these kind of things. With I can come up with some examples for another time, but what they do is, they become so committed to it, that they create this desperate situation, and they don't care that they're doing that to everybody else too. I don't know why they have this. If you wish hard enough, if you believe hard enough, that reality will change. If you could just get everybody to foster the same delusion and really, really invest in it, that somehow it'll happen. I don't know where the logic is in that.
Well, I put something in one of the last chapters in my book about some scientific studies that were done and the original ones were done like back in the 1950s. And a person was shown a straight line, and then they were shown three other straight lines of different lengths, same length as the initial line. And it was rather simple to do. And so people were given this test, and almost everyone got everyone right. But then what they did was they put them in a room with five other people. I
don't understand what you mean. Somebody's shown a line, and
yes,
then they show them three other lines of the same length.
Of different lengths.
Only
one of the three is the same as the initial line.
Oh, so the test is to tell which of the three lines is the same line as the same length as the line you just looked at.
Yes. Okay. Yes. And it's a very simple test. Everybody gets it right. Until you put the person in a room with five other people, all who are actors, who are all say it's a different line than that. And then a surprising number will go along with the group. Even though it's obviously wrong, if they didn't have the group there, they would get it right. They get it wrong because all the others are saying that. And so I always wondered, what is going on in your brain to do this? And so other tests were done relatively recently when they had functional MRI. And it was a different test. It wasn't the lines, but it was a geometrical configuration on a computer screen that you had to sort of rotate in your mind and see which coincided with the other. Just about everybody got them all right. And under the influence of the group, they got a higher percentage got them wrong. And then they did an MRI to see what was going on in the brain when this happened. And I thought, well, the amygdala, the active part of the brain that gets, when you're excited or anxious or emotionally upset, fires up. I thought there's going to be an internal battle trying to match the two up, and the amygdala is going to light up. But it didn't. It was the areas of that you would expect to be using just to figure it out in the first place. The ones that disagreed with the group and insisted on getting right, their amygdala lit up. They were the anxious ones. If you went along with the group, you were able to convince yourself that you really agreed with the group. It wasn't that you're fighting against them, you agreed with them for that. And so, I mean, the premise I put out was caveman times in human beings, you had to accept what the elders taught you. Otherwise, you'd be eaten by a bear, or you'd eat a poisonous plant, or you couldn't build a shelter, or you couldn't get food. You had to accept the wisdom of the elders. And I think that evolved into our brain. And so as children, when you have religion, this is something we don't doubt. It's true. You don't even consider doubting it. And then as you get older and it doesn't add up, it's true to go along with the group. It's too emotionally traumatic. That doesn't make any sense.
I've seen when people have, when somehow they've never had that encounter with an unbeliever who actually knows something of what they're talking about, so that that first conflict, that first contact with somebody that has a valid counter argument or evidence against their position, there's a very hostile reaction. It's brash. I remember watching an Islamic interviewer who was talking to an atheist, and it was obviously the first time that person had ever encountered an atheist ever in their lives, and it was nearly violent, very incendiary. So I mean, this is what I experienced when people have met a number of atheists. Of course, they become a lot more tolerant about that, which is another reason that I'm part of the Atheist Out program. That I advocate that if you don't believe, come out and say you don't believe. And we need lots of other people to come out and say that they don't believe, because this is a mess. That you can't run for political office without pretending to believe something. It doesn't matter if you actually believe, you have to pretend to believe it so that people's ridiculous little insecurities will be placated somehow. That's a sad situation. You can't be honest with yourself or anybody else.
Well, let me just mention the title of my book, which is not immediately obvious to everybody. As I mentioned, when I was very young, if you were going to seek high office, you had to be a white male Protestant. 15, John F. Kennedy was the first and so far only. And we now have an African-American president. A year from now, I certainly hope we have a woman president. We have in Congress.
Are you sure?
Hindu,
I mean, that sounds like a racist statement against Oompa Loompas. You don't want an orange president?
We have an African-American president. We should have a woman president. We have Hindu, Muslim, openly gay.
No, I understand what you're saying. I was making a joke. I was making a joke about Trump. I guess the mic must not have carried it across.
All right. Okay.
That's why I said Oompa Loompa.
So my question was, why can't atheists run? Why are we the last lepers in the colony? So that's the title of the book.
Well, yeah. Give me the title of the book again so that people can look it up, please, and I'll make sure to include a link at the bottom.
Okay. The title is Last Leper in the Colony, an Atheist Runs for Congress in the Bible Belt.
Can you explain why the title?
Pardon me?
Why did you choose Last Leper in the Colony?
Well, like I said, now, why are atheists the only ones that can't run for office in the public perception?
Gotcha.
Why are we the last atheists in the colony?
Very good, very good. All right, and I guess we are at about the end. I'm going to let you get a closing statement in there, and I kind of, as part of that, I'd also like you to include what would you suggest for people who want to become involved in politics, who are tired of the situation and are open unbelievers. What would you say to someone who wants to run for Texas State Senate, who everybody already knows is an atheist? What advice would you give to that person?
Well, I mean, one thing that Randy Forbes refused to do was debate me, because he came out and said, his quote was, "He attacked me for being a Christian. I never attacked him for being an atheist." Well, that was false. I never attacked him for being a Christian. So if I could have gotten him in a debate, I could have pinned him down. He clearly made it clear he didn't think a non-believer should be in office. I wanted to confront him directly, and he did everything he could to avoid it. The League of Women Voters scheduled a debate on television between the two of us 2.5 months in advance, and he wouldn't do it. So, and people advising me who were non-believers advised me not to come out as a non-believer. I think we as non-believers need to get over that.
Yeah.
If we are open about it and can talk directly to believers and say, you know, I don't believe what you believe, but this is a free country. You can believe whatever you want. But this country has mainly been run throughout its history. You know, everyone goes on about what a mess we're in. Well, it's Christians that have got us there for the most part. You know, everyone who claims to be a good Christian has voted, and they're on Democrats and Republicans because, as I mentioned, Democrats didn't want much to do with me either. I think the more people come out, I think that's the only way to do it. The gay community decided we're going to come out. And it was a surprisingly short amount of time where gays are now accepted. More than they were, certainly, not as openly as they should be, but they've made great progress.
They have been a very successful movement despite the opposition they still face.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And there are atheists everywhere. I mean, if every atheist came out, a lot fewer people would be going to church. I knew one fellow said, well, I don't really believe, but I like to sing in the choir. So the choirs would empty out. People go there because it's socially acceptable. It needs to be socially acceptable to be a non-believer.
And the only way that's going to happen is like you said, when enough people come out that they realize that there's a substantial number. Right now, people want to identify on polls as though they are, humanist, or they very often unbelievers. I've met people who identify as Christian, even though they admit that they don't believe in their scriptures and they don't believe in a God.
Right. All right.
And the statistics that I've seen for people that give the reasons why they should be classified as atheists, but they don't use the atheist label, implies that at least a quarter of the country, if not a third of the country, are actually unbelievers. But the sad thing is instead of 30% atheist, we report as atheist only at 3%.
Right.
Which is useless. This is why we have no political influence, and this is why everybody's trying to push their religious agenda against all the non-believers, because they think that the non-believers don't have any strength.
Right.
They have no idea.
And I mean, Bernie Sanders, they asked him if he believed in God, and he said yes. And they said, well, what is God? And he said, well, God is everybody helping each other.
Yeah.
Well, that's not the usual definition. And I mean, Jill Stein, who I hope nobody votes for, I agree with her politics, but she's going to wreck things. Jill Stein is openly agnostic, but she's going to get very little vote. There it is.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for being on, and thank you for your perspective, and thank you for the advice for anybody that wants to get into politics. One of the key things I think there was when you said talking to people who have already been through those ropes and know where the pitfalls are. You know, I can't imagine anybody that I know that's running for public office having any sway in a black church. That's a frustrating thing. Even when they're black, they don't have any sway, because what I'm hearing is that despite the cordial treatment that you're talking about, once you make that admission,
Right.
the environment changes dramatically. You know, and then we
I
get
was
like
rather naive on.
Yeah.
I thought when I showed up, I was showing my support for freedom of religion. When I showed up at a church, they thought I was a believer, which was naive on my part.
Yeah.
And assuming I was a believer, they were very cordial. And I'm sure they wouldn't be otherwise. They just distance.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dr. LeGrow, thank you for being on the Raw Men. I'm going to go ahead and close it up. And as I said, any links that you want to include for your book or whatever, anything else you'd like to refer, we'll go ahead and put it down below. And good night, everybody.